Now, government buildings are reported to be on fire in the Libyan capital, Tripoli, as demonstrators demand an end to the 41-year rule of Colonel Gaddafi. The son of the Libyan leader blamed opposition groups and outsiders for instigating.
This ties into a more global pattern where we have to understand the major geopolitical long-term planning emanating from such organizations as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderberg Group, who have for decades been fighting the Arab world and have been fighting the sovereign nation state as an institution on a global basis. So in a way, if they can get rid of these strong men, whether it be Hosni Mubarak in Egypt or Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and try to transition, as I was saying before, to a more liberal, chaotic, and more controllable Western-style democracy, that would serve their interests. So I think we have to be very careful about the various readings that we make of this.
Information from Russia's joint staff, who are saying that they have been monitoring the situation in Libya from space via satellites since the beginning of the unrest in the country. And according to them, some of the reports made by the Western media are not entirely corresponding to the pictures that they are getting. To be more precise, according to Al Jazeera and to BBC, on the 22nd of February, Libyan government has inflicted airstrikes on Benghazi, the biggest city in the country, and on Tripoli. And according to Russia's military, they have not registered any of those airstrikes. According to them, the pictures show that nothing of that sort has been going on the ground. Pretty much make a judgment that those attacks, which the Western media has been reporting on, have not been made.
Colonel Gaddafi is really going to all extremes to push back, to make his presence felt. In an interview he gave and in an interview his son gave today, Saturday, both of them denied reports that the East was in the hands of the rebels. They said that they were in control, that everything was calm, and that any kind of reporting that the government was killing its own people was simply untrue. They blamed the Western media for what they have termed propaganda. People here simply do not want the foreign community to get involved. They believe that any kind of humanitarian assistance very often is an excuse for military aid and military intervention. The latest news we have, though, is that the British government today, Saturday, confirmed that it was deploying to Libya within the next 24 hours. We know that they say that this deployment is for evacuation and humanitarian purposes, but as I'm mentioning, many people here are concerned that it will also come with some kind of military aspect.
Western powers have frozen the assets of Muammar Gaddafi and other senior figures in the Libyan government. They say the aim is to help bring down the government refusing the will of its people. But as RT's Lauren Lister reports, history suggests Libya may never see its money again after the international wealth grab.
As violence continues in Libya, the U.S. sends warships and more troops in that direction, fueling speculation of a military intervention. Meanwhile, Western countries may have already launched a war against Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi's North African regime.
Most countries consider the freezing of their assets as an act of economic warfare.
The weapons here, the foreign assets of either Libya, the country, or Gaddafi and his family, that some estimate to be almost $100 billion. It's believed to be spread across the globe, oil money invested through the country's sovereign wealth fund, and billions of dollars of cash in banks throughout Europe and the U.S. The question now is what happens to all this money, especially the $30 billion the United States has frozen, the most ever in the history of this country in this type of situation. It essentially cuts Libya off from the entire U.S. banking system. To enact these sanctions, the U.S. president declared the situation in Libya, quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy. That's not typical considering there's not a clear aggressive action Libya has taken against the U.S. As for Libya's financial interests, analysts say you could look to the history of countries such as Iran. Their assets were frozen in the wake of the 1979 hostage crisis.
Their money that was seized from Iran back in 1979 has still, not been returned to the Iranians. So it's basically time for a plunder play. If we can take it away from them, we will.
Fog of war has settled over the unrest in Libya. There's conflicting reports on the number of killed, airstrikes by Gaddafi forces, the number of cities controlled by the opposition, pretty much everything that's being reported. Last week, a wave of correspondence suggested the opposition was in control of almost the whole country and Gaddafi was doomed. RT's Oksana Boyko went to the opposition-held Benghazi to find out why these turned out to be exaggerations.
For it. On TV screens, Benghazi may look like the center of the rebel resistance.
The country is waking to another day of chaos.
Gaddafi may have lost about half of his country.
They watched these bombs fall from the skies.
But in reality, it's more like a seaside resort than a conflict zone. Hotels are fully booked with journalists, and residents go about their daily lives. Here, boys are looking for new things to play with. Toy guns are in ample supply. Yet some reports sent from Benghazi refer to the situation in eastern Libya as war. Not a conflict zone where rebels are engaged in sporadic and isolated pitched battles with pro-Gaddafi forces, but an all-out war.
Muammar Gaddafi is striking back.
Forces loyal to Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi appear to be advancing east.
Libya's leader Muammar Gaddafi has fled the country.
With rebels professing their readiness to fight Gaddafi's regime to the bitter end, no wonder news reports are carrying predictions of imminent civil war. Yet, as the rebels' inability to mount a fully fledged offensive becomes more apparent, so is the unbalanced nature of the coverage.
Rather than being impartial observers, some networks stop short of directing the protesters. But here, the Al Jazeera crew is warming up the crowd in time for their next live report.
The United States and NATO are supporting an armed insurrection in eastern Libya with a view to eventually justifying a humanitarian intervention. Now, there's evidence that, in fact, Allied forces are already on the ground. We've seen reports of the British SAS, but we've seen other reports that say that, in fact, the number of special forces and intelligence agents on the ground is in the several hundred. This is not a protest movement, as in Egypt and Tunisia. This is an armed insurrection, and public opinion has been led to believe somehow that conditions in Egypt and Tunisia have, so to speak, spread to Libya, and that this is a spontaneous insurrection. It's not. It's been planned well in advance. General actually makes the statement that if there is the establishment of a no-fly zone, and he was very explicit on that, this would essentially mean also a bombing campaign, because you'd have to take out air defense. And what is implied and what is on the drawing board, I'm not suggesting it will be carried out, but it's on the drawing board, is an all-out blitzkrieg directed against a sovereign country in violation of international law.
Sure.
This is part of the battle for oil. Libya has 3.5% of global oil reserves, twice those of the United States. It's one of the major oil producers. It supplies large amounts of oil to the European Union. Geopolitical implications are far-reaching. It's essentially what Washington is aiming at is to establish a sphere of influence in North Africa, establish control over these oil reserves, which constitute billions and billions of dollars of proceeds for the oil companies.
What is your general take on why there is so much misinformation and conflicting reports when it comes to Libya?
Well, it's basically a psychological operation. There's an entire wing of the Pentagon and the State Department that's dedicated to psychological operations. These are perception management is the modern term, and the previous term was propaganda. But psychological operation is to convince the American public or the English-speaking world and English news-consuming world that something's going on that may or may not be actually happening, and that's what we're seeing a lot of with respect to Libya. There's no shortage of war zones to go to today where people are dying at the rate of 1,500 people a day in eastern Congo. Journalists go in and out of there, but it's not being reported at all. Same thing with Sudan. There's conflict going on in certain regions of Sudan. The conflict in Afghanistan. But what we're getting is a pro-U.S., pro-Pentagon, one-sided picture of a situation which fills the media with the idea that there's freedom fighters involved in Libya and that there's a government regime that's been an atrocious terrorist government. In fact, the oil maps of Libya are huge, and the oil concessions are huge, and it's a massive oil operation that's been going on with the support and the involvement of Italy, France, and Britain since 1970, since 1959 when the oil was discovered, but the U.S. hasn't had a piece of that pie. So the idea is to continue to convince the American public that genocide is happening in Libya, which is absolute nonsense, and therefore we need to take the all-powerful white American role is to go out there and save somebody that needs saving, when actually we're involved in the killing because I believe we're supporting the rebels in Libya.
All right, so a UN resolution adopted in February suggests that Gaddafi might face the International Criminal Court over this. Is there a similarity between Gaddafi's position now and that of Slobodan Milosevic in the late 90s in Serbia?
I would say that there's definitely been a pattern implemented ever since the 1990s that any particular government that is being targeted for regime change is being criminalized and demonized in the press.
Libya's opposition has told Colonel Muammar Gaddafi if he leaves the country now, they won't put him on trial. But Libyan state television has broadcast denials that Gaddafi offered to quit if his family was allowed to safely leave the country. Violence continues in parts of Libya more than 3 weeks after protests erupted. A little later in the program, we'll have a live report from RT's Paula Slier in Tripoli. For now, though, just a week ago, media reports suggested that Gaddafi was close to defeat, but today he's still there, and news of his downfall proved to be exaggerated. Earlier, our Paula Slier went to Tripoli to uncover how things really stood.
Part of the criticism reports that Gaddafi's warplanes bombed and killed dozens of protesters in the capital city.
Future of Libya appears to be on a knife edge. Fighter jets have been bombarding the capital, Tripoli, reportedly on the orders of leader Muammar Gaddafi.
Later on, they told us that Tripoli is bombed by Air Force and heavy guns or something like that. And completely it's not true.
The truth seems more to be a city going about its everyday business. These are hardly the pictures of a city on the brink of war.
Meanwhile, Libya's capital Tripoli is bracing for what could be another night of gunfire, explosions, and fighting. Eyewitnesses say warplanes had been firing at opposition supporters from the air.
The war is clearly not in Tripoli. And just as clearly, Western media has been a little too quick to write off Gaddafi.
At the same time, there's a lot of movement on the international stage. There are still discussions for a no-fly zone to be implemented. The latest word from the U.S. administration and the American President Barack Obama is that America is still considering military intervention. Now, the U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates has been caught speaking quite red-faced. I mean, he didn't realize that he was actually mic'd, and he was met at the airport in Kabul, Afghanistan, by General Petraeus, and Petraeus joked to quote him, "Welcome back, sir, flying a little bigger plane than normal. You're going to launch some attacks on Libya or something." And to which the U.S. Defense Secretary responded by laughing and replying, "Yeah, exactly." So that certainly is something that has caught the American administration and embarrassed